I find this quite concerning because I know these are self-assessments basically by the multinationals, isn't that right? And you say you're working blind on them, Mr. Moran. Did you use the word blind on it? On the reasons?
Let me put it another way.
On the reasons?
The detail becomes available at a later stage. I mean, one of the things, Deputy, if I might...
Did you make a call to any multinationals when you got these figures and said, hey, what the hell's going on?
What we do, sorry, is there are case managers in revenue which deal directly with the large cases, the large firms on a sort of daily basis. And we use that interaction, the information that they supply to the case managers, to inform our forecast at the beginning of the year. But it is important to stress that no multinational is compelled to provide the information. Multinationals are probably conservative in terms of the information that they will supply, but we can only take what we are given. It is purely a voluntary exercise. That forms part of our, we have an econometric model that we use, but we also supplement it with judgment based on that interaction. The Fiscal Advisory Council, funnily enough, has assessed our approach to forecasting the various tax heads and has concluded that using that judgment actually improves the forecasting accuracy.
Okay, well, we can take it then that you don't know where the money's come from, this extra spike, because you're only working on historic information, and this is the multinationals themselves telling you that this is what they accept as their tax liability, in effect. Is that true?
We know that it's broad-based, not just the multinationals.
That doesn't tell you very much. We know that's a pretty wide expression. We know it's broad-based, of course you know that, but you do know that it's hugely multinational-based, and it's self-assessed.
Yes, but we also know that the SME sector is paying more with a growth rate that is in advance of what the multinational sector might pay. We know that there are new firms who had no corporate tax liability in previous years because of carrying losses and so forth. They are now entering into having a tax liability, and that sort of is, I suppose, signals the recovery in the economy.
Okay, if you don't know where it's coming from, how do you know that it's permanent and it's going to keep coming?
No, if I might, I mean, this in that contact between the revenue commissioners and the taxpayer, which is the most appropriate. It's not appropriate for us to talk directly to taxpayers. You know, the feedback is that this is a base effect. It's not one-off.
Where's the feedback from?
From the multinationals themselves.
Yeah, and you believe them?
Large cases. Well, the corporation tax system is, like a lot of the tax system, is self-assessed.
Correct.
You know, I mean, that's a fact.
And have they assured you that it'll be okay for the following years, 2016, 17 then?
I mean, it's very expensive to give us money up front, Deputy, and sort of overpay.
But have you asked them whether it'll be the same in 16, 17, 18?
That it's to the extent that it feeds into the base. So this isn't a one-off initiative and then falls away. We have identified some one-off payments. I think about 300 million there that have been identified. These fall out. So they have been.
That's the revenue, isn't it?
That's the revenue.
Yeah.
And those engagements between large cases and large case division and the companies, and in my experience, tend to identify those sort of negatives much more easily than the positives. You know, that they know there's an event coming up and you can identify that. But we have the one-offs, and coming back to the base. One of the things, Deputy, is all taxes are to a greater or lesser cyclical. They move with the economy. Corporation tax has the additional thing of accounting peculiarities, which is the carrying of losses, exhausting those losses, and going from paying no tax to paying a sizable amount of tax fairly quickly. But if you look at the contribution of corporation tax to total taxes, you know, over a prolonged period of time, what you'd be looking for is for it to leap outside the bound of that, and that would really, you know, kind of. And generally speaking, corporation tax contributes somewhere between 11 and perhaps as high as 16% of total taxes. Okay, over the years, and this going back, let's go back to the start of the century. We're estimating that this year it'll contribute 15.5%. So it's within those bounds, which says at least it gives you a very aggregate level assurance that there's something. Yeah, it's at the higher end, but and during the it's. I mean, if just some of the figures in front of me, we can provide these. You know, in 2001 it was 14.9%, 2002 16.4%, but then in recent years it fell down to 10 and 11%. And perhaps you're seeing that recovery, but it hasn't gone outside the bound of that movement, which is what you see with the cycle. So that gives us, and it's a very aggregate level, and I agree with you, Debbie, it's a very aggregate level comfort that there's not something that there are always risks in this, and the concentration risk, as Mr. McCarthy has referenced it, we did a bit of work in 2015 and published with a budget around that. That's always going to, but that hasn't changed. It's within the bound of the payments that we've seen over a 15-year period or 20-year period. Sorry, John, you.
Can I follow up, Deputy, just very briefly? I mean, I just want to assure you that we ourselves are concerned whether this would be a windfall or a cyclical, and that was the origin of our query with revenue. Well, we've put the Revenue Commissioner, the Chairman of the Revenue Commission, the letter on our website, but just let me read you. Based on information derived from engagement of revenue case managers with the companies, we expect that much of this surplus will reoccur next year. We have informed your department that it is likely that approximately 300 million of the 2015 surplus from these large groups should not be included, and we haven't, in the forecast for 2016. Okay, so I think that gives us some reassurance, because we don't deal with the firms themselves. I would also draw attention as well, just from a policy perspective, and I know we don't want to go down that route, but the reforms to the Stability and Growth Pact in 2011 introduced the concept of the so-called expenditure benchmark. The whole rationale for the expenditure benchmark is that you cannot spend cyclical or one-off receipts. Okay, so you're simply prevented from doing that by law. So there's no question of sort of repeating the mistakes of the past by using these receipts, windfall or not, for permanent increases in expenditure.
Okay, I mean, there's a big debate, as you know, going on about whether these are windfall or not. You have one position. Fiscal Advisory Council doesn't agree with you, as you know. There are warnings coming thick and fast from other sources, including the European Commission, including The Economist magazine, including other sources as well as that. Could I ask you a question then? How did you get it so wrong?
Well, I mean, our forecasts
for corporate tax. For corporate tax,
sure. Yeah, because all the other tax heads are pretty much there or thereabouts as to where we thought that they would be. I think one of the main factors underpinning the overshoot on the CT side relates to the stronger than assumed economic growth that we're having. So, at the time of the 2015 budget.
So that includes your own assumption of the economic growth. It didn't come out of the blue. You had economic growth.
Absolutely. It was our assumption,
completely wrong.
Indeed, but it was endorsed by the Fiscal Advisory Council at the time. And there were a lot of changes in the external environment. I mean, we had not included in our forecast the easing in the monetary policy stance, QE, which took effect from January. We had included in our forecast, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, an assumption that the euro-dollar exchange rate would be about 130. I think that euro sterling was about 0.78, I think, if I recall correctly. With QE, with the massive reduction in oil prices, and they fell by 50% between when we did our forecast and the beginning of this year. Okay, all these factors had a major impact in terms of where the economy was going. The exchange rate is particularly important because the exchange rate has a big impact on nominal GDP. Okay, this year we will have nominal output growth of about 11.5%. Okay, about half of that is due to the deflator. And that in turn is due to exchange rate movements. Okay, we have to take assumptions that are supplied to all euro area member states as part of the so-called two-pack, because we have to produce a common budgetary, the common budgetary timeline and common budgetary assumptions and so forth. So we had to use these exogenous variables. Now there was a massive change in some of those variables because of something that was unforeseen in September, October 2014. namely the stance of monetary policy. So with that, we revised upwards our forecast for economic growth in April, and in September of this year, we revised it upwards substantially again, because the data flow has surprised everybody. The outturn has been exceptionally strong in real and in nominal terms in both Q1 and Q2. I think high-frequency data in Q3 are very, very strong.
Sorry, can I interrupt you a second? You're talking about the growth rate now.
I'm talking about the growth rate.
I'm not talking about the growth rate.
And the growth
I'm
rate.
talking about the corporate tax rate.
The growth rate. What we do is
you got the growth rate wrong.
Yep.
But let's get the corporate tax rate. Let's go
the
to
growth
how
rate.
did you get that wrong?
The growth rate is relevant in the sense that what we do is within the growth rate we forecast the wage bill and the profit bill. Okay, and profitability in national accounting terms is so-called gross operating surplus. With the change in the growth rate, we changed our forecast for the gross operating surplus for profitability, okay, which at the time of the budget for 15 was for a forecast of just north of 5%, whereas we now think it'll probably be about 15, 16, maybe 17%. Okay, but having said that, I will say right here and right now that does not explain. You know, they typically move one for one over time, profitability and CT revenue. The fact that CT is now 52%, I think, above for the year as a whole, there is a massive gap between those two variables, and that's where I come back to. We're looking at the econometric models, so are revenue. But it is important to bear in mind that because of the concentration in Ireland, not just of GDP or of gross value add and so forth, but of the tax system, firm-specific developments can have a major impact that you simply cannot capture in any econometric model. Nobody can.
Was there a firm-specific event here in Ireland that affected corporate tax? Was Apple
we would
paying
not
a
be
huge amount?
privy. We are simply not allowed. We are prevented under the legislation, and rightly so, from having access to firm-specific information. Revenue.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, but you can tell us what you think. You can have a pretty educated guess. I don't want you to name a company or name a multinational, but were there specific multinationals paying a lot more than they did last year, suddenly?
I think I'd point out, Deputy, I mean, you know, the analysis that's been provided, I mean, last year, the top 10 companies, and that's what we're talking about in this, the top 10 group paid about a third of the corporation tax, and they're doing the same again. So, you know, what within that, don't know, but it's the risk in terms of that concentration hasn't shifted hugely. It's a bit like my point about the total contribution to tax take has operated within a band, but it's not outside of that band.
But your colleague did say firm-specific.
They can do. They can do.
They can distort the figures,
They can.
And did that happen this time? I don't want you to name anyone. Did that happen this time?
A significant part of the overshoot is down to a very small number of firms.
Yeah. Are there any particular ones?
I don't know.
Of course.
I don't know. I do not have access, and
I
nor
don't want
should
the identity, but do you see that there might be one single one or two or three?
I simply don't have that information.
Have you asked the question?
I'm not allowed to have access to that information because I cannot have access to firm-specific information or information that could lead me to deduce which firm it might be.
So you're, as you say yourself, travelling blind on that one as well.
Unfortunately, use the words on my part. I mean, in the end of the day, Debbie, just to reiterate, this has, for a range of reasons, sort of significantly overperformed. We're going to do the econometric analysis as the data comes through, try to understand where this came from, and we may have far better answers in due course. I think it would have pushed the bounds of credibility in October 2014 and preparing for 2015 to have put this type of forecast for CT in. I think there wouldn't have been any basis for it. We tend to operate off the basis of national accounts estimating of profitability, and we revert to, for next year, I think it's about 8% growth was what we had on budget day. To a certain extent, that becomes de-risked because the performance has been so strong this year that we are close to achieving the target for next year. So to get that and keep your budget on target for next year, you actually don't need any growth. So that removes a bit of it. But I mean, I think the interesting thing over the course of the year has been, we planned a budget in October of 2014 for 15, which had a deficit target of 2.7. By April, we were saying 2.4, October 2.1, and it now looks like it's 1.7. All of this is essentially feeding through into the deficit coming down more rapidly, which is I think has to be regarded as a positive, and that in itself removes some of the risk. But the performance this year, is up very close to the total target for next year, which we know we've a very large amount of work to do to try and understand this. And we will be doing that.
Okay, I mean, I won't be long. Can I just cover more things? I mean, I'm quite concerned about this. It's quite important, Chairman. We've got a situation here where the Department of Finance is in the dark about an incredibly significant figure, an extraordinary thing that's happening in our economy. They don't know why it happened, and they're admitting they don't know why it happened. They've got a lot of work to do. That is very worrying, indeed. That means that we can't, for one moment, believe any assessment, whether it's permanent, whether this is a permanent income, or whether it's not, because you don't know where it's coming from yourselves or why it's coming. Could you compare this for a second with the construction industry boom in, say, 2007, which ended there? What percentage of the taxes came from the construction industry at that time, which have now gone away and collapsed?
Don't have the figures at the top of my head, but somewhere around 15% would be a best guess, without having the actual figures in front of me.
Do you see the danger?
I don't think there's any question of corporation tax going from such a high level to practically zero, which is what happened on the construction side. They practically went to zero overnight. There may be a fall, we don't know, and we do have information. I wouldn't accept the we don't know. We have information from revenue that tell us that these will be repeated next year in all likelihood, with the exception of a small amount. Okay, but even if it's not a case of going from 15% to 1%, as happened in the construction sector.
I presume revenue was saying, agreed your projections for this year. Last year, in other words.
Well, it's an iterative process.
So revenue are just as likely.
Revenue can.
I mean, revenue is not a great crutch on which to lean when you've got so many others outside saying, hey, this is dangerous.
Well, I suppose revenue can only deal with the information that they get to hand, the information that is supplied to them via their large cases division, which interact, as I say, quite regularly with the multinationals. So they are subject to, the data quality that may come. But as I said earlier on, there's no obligation on the companies within that division to supply the data, and there's no obligation to supply, absolutely accurate data. They may simply not know, because they may start out the year thinking we'll have a good year, and suddenly the exchange rate goes from 130 to parity. Things suddenly get very, very better. The world changes.
Okay, so we are now as dependent, percentage-wise, on the multinationals today as we were on the construction industry.
Yeah. I mean, the average.
And at that time, we had two pillars of support. Now we've only got one.
The revenue from the construction sector was clearly windfall revenue. I would not accept that revenue from these corporations is windfall, and that is backed up by what revenue are saying. If you look at it over time, Deputy, the average corporation tax as a percentage of overall receipts, I think the Secretary-General made reference earlier on, is somewhere in the region 14–15%. We're actually not that far from the historical average. I do have figures here somewhere going back to, I think, 1995. So to say that just because the 15% coincides with the 15% in construction, that's coincidental.
Sorry, if I might come in on that. I mean, the revenue commissioners are closest to the companies and the information that's coming in and where this is coming from. And I mean, the chairman's letter of of last week before is fairly detailed in indicating this across the board, and it's substantially other than a very small amount, not one-off. I have to say, and it goes back to my point, is if you look at stamp duties and capital gains tax back in the early part of the last decade, they went from 2 or 3% of total tax to 15 and collapsed back to that again. Okay, my point is that the share of total taxation coming from the corporate sector has been in this band, consistently over periods of time, and even at the worst of times, it went down, but it didn't collapse in that way. So this is a sort of a much. I mean, there are always risks, but this is a much less risky revenue result than would have been those that were derived from the.
Yeah, I'd just be very worried about the dependence. I'll just conclude. Yeah, I'd be very worried about the dependence. Could I just ask one question about the Apple case, which we are defending, apparently, against, where Europe says that there's a matter of state aid, an issue of state aid, and where two nations have already been all over the coals and actually found to have breached it. Is it true that you've already employed a barrister to defend Ireland in the case of it going to the European Court of Justice?
We have a legal team
on that already, in anticipation of losing that case.
Well, sorry, the deputy. It's not anticipation of losing it, because when you get the case dated, you have to legally respond to that, which we have done, and you assemble your team for that. So the preliminary, I don't have the dates quite set, but they would have stated a case in May, and we had to in May of 2014, and we would have had to respond to that, and we would have had the legal team available to actually do that. They would have published it then later that year, and we would have intervened in that. So we have a legal team for it? Yes, but it's not anticipation of losing. And as has been said, if there is a finding, this has been going on for 2.5 years, 2.5 years. We don't, there's no sense.
I think the minister has said that in the case of you losing, you're going to appeal it.
Yes, and in terms of I think it was the Netherlands, and in terms of one of the cases, have already announced that they're going to the European Court as well.
So in that case, you'll be saying we don't want to pursue Apple for the billions or whatever amount it is that is apparently owed if the judgment comes against
No, Deputy, what we're saying is that if it comes to that, and we have no ruling, is that it's our very strong view that there was nothing done wrong at the Irish Tax Administration, and we'll seek to defend that.
And to turn away the money. Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Deputy Dolan.